The slap landed at 12:40 on a Tuesday afternoon, and for 3 full seconds the marble lobby of Harborline Tower didn't make a sound. An elevator opened and closed with nobody stepping into it. Sadie Brennan was 27 years old and 6 months along, and she stood there with one hand flat against her cheek, and the other still gripping the strap of a delivery bag she'd carried up 30 flights of stairs that morning because the freight elevator wasn't working. At her feet, a rain-soaked document box had split open across the stone. Priscilla Vance, 43, Regional Director of Operations, didn't lower her voice. She told Sadie she'd embarrassed the company in front of a client for the last time, and 30 people stood there and watched a pregnant woman lower herself onto that cold floor and start picking up wet paper, one sheet at a time, because rent was due at the end of that week, and she had $61 to her name. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. But Priscilla had just made a mistake she wouldn't understand for another few weeks. At table 7 of the lobby cafe, 6 men in dark coats had been sitting since noon. They weren't customers, and the one with his back to the door, the one who hadn't looked up from his coffee in 20 minutes, was about to stand. His name was Enzo Castellano. He was 34 years old, and every square foot of that building belonged to him. He didn't shout. He didn't hurry. He walked over, picked up the one thing that had rolled loose from her bag, a firefighter's helmet with a name stamped inside the brim, and he read it. And he went very still. Then he took out his phone and made a call that lasted 40 seconds and cost somebody everything. If a story like this stirs something in you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to 6 o'clock that morning and meet the woman who never should have been on that floor at all. At 6 o'clock in the morning, rain had already been falling for no one knew how long, and the ground floor hallway of the apartment building on Bramble Street was dimly lit, like a shadow that hadn't fully awakened. Sadie Brennan crouched beside the electric bicycle leaning against the wall, one hand braced against her knee to make standing less difficult, while the other lifted the battery compartment cover so she could check the charge. The indicator showed only a little more than half. She knew what that meant without needing to calculate much of anything. It would be enough for the morning, not enough for the afternoon, and she would have to pedal up the slope toward downtown, just as she had done for the past several weeks. She closed the battery cover, wiped her hand against her pant leg, then rose slowly in the way a woman 6 months pregnant was forced to learn. In the kitchen of her second-floor apartment, she didn't look at the calendar hanging beside the door. She opened the refrigerator and looked inside, because the refrigerator told the truth more honestly than the calendar did. Half a carton of eggs, a container of milk with only a little left at the bottom, several slices of bread she had cut in half so they would last for 2 meals, and a container of rice she had cooked on Sunday evening and still hadn't finished. That was how she counted, by measuring what remained in the refrigerator, and that method told her the next payday was farther away than the food in her home could endure. She took out 2 slices of bread, ate one while standing beside the sink, and packed the other into her bag for lunch. Then she opened the company application. Orders appeared one line at a time, far more than a delivery worker was permitted to accept during a single shift, and she sat on the edge of a chair, scrolled downward, and accepted them one after another until nothing remained on the screen. She knew she shouldn't do it. Her body had been telling her so for more than a month, through the brief waves of dizziness that came whenever she stood too quickly, and the dull ache in her back that lasted until midnight. But she knew something else as well. The rent was due at the end of the week. Exactly $61 remained in her account, and there was no one in the world who would make up the difference for her. Before leaving, she took the oversized coat hanging behind the bathroom door, and beside it, Owen's old firefighter's helmet, which she carried in her bag every day like a silent shield, and pushed them into her backpack. She didn't wear the coat while making deliveries because it was cumbersome and hot. She wore it only when she had to stand before someone from the company, whenever she needed her body to resemble that of an ordinarily exhausted person, instead of someone carrying inside her the reason her routes might be cut. Several women on her team had announced happy news, and she remembered very clearly what had happened to their schedules the following week. She closed the backpack and lifted it onto her shoulders. It felt heavier than usual that morning. She adjusted the straps until the weight was balanced, thought no more about it, and stepped into the rain. A few minutes before 7 o'clock, she arrived at the freight entrance of Harborline Tower, swiped the card a maintenance worker had given her several months earlier, so she wouldn't have to wait outside on mornings when no one was stationed at the door, then pushed the delivery cart inside. 13 floors waited for her that morning, and she didn't yet know that by noon she would be walking. Meanwhile, on the 14th floor of another building nearly 2 miles away, Priscilla Vance stood before a conference room and advanced to the next slide. She spoke about efficiency, about narrowing profit margins, and about how the company couldn't continue carrying a staffing model designed for another era. Then she presented the proposal. The entire delivery team would be moved to independent service contracts. There would be no more employees. There would only be partners. The company would pay for each completed delivery, and anything beyond that delivery would no longer be the company's concern. The room fell silent in the way people became silent when they understood, but didn't yet want to say so aloud. A team leader seated at the far end of the table raised his hand and cautiously asked what would happen to people experiencing health problems. Priscilla didn't need to consider her answer. She looked directly at him and said the company paid for results, not reasons. No one asked another question. The meeting ended earlier than expected, and after everyone had left, her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen, and something in the way she held herself changed. She stepped into the hallway, pressed the phone to her ear, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer that of the woman who had just commanded an entire room. She said yes 3 times. She said she understood. She said the contract with Harborline would be signed again that day, and that she would personally go there to ensure the first delivery happened exactly as it was supposed to happen. Then she ended the call, remained still for a single beat, and walked directly toward the elevator. At that same hour, in the North End, a man stepped onto a narrow street where no one else had yet passed and stopped before a faded metal door. Enzo Castellano bent down, inserted a key into the lock at the foot of the door, and raised it with his own hands. The shriek of metal carried so clearly through the wet street that every bird perched on the utility wires took flight. He did this every Tuesday morning, and the people who lived nearby had grown so accustomed to it that no one asked anymore why a man like him personally opened a small bakery when he could have ordered anyone else to do it. Inside, the scent of flour and sugar still lingered from the previous day. He switched on the lights above the counter, opened the window curtains, and straightened several chairs someone had left out of place the night before. At the far end of the inner room, against the wall on the right, a staircase led to the second floor. The staircase had been sealed behind wooden planks, nailed across it diagonally, and a notice whose 4 corners had yellowed was attached to the uppermost board. Enzo passed it on his way to retrieve a broom. He passed it again when he returned the broom to its place. Neither time did he look up. Shortly after 7 o'clock, Gio Falcone pushed open the door, shook the rain from the shoulders of his coat, and sat at the table near the counter where he had been sitting since Enzo's father was still alive. He waited until Enzo had poured 2 cups of coffee before speaking. 3 contractors had withdrawn from the harbor project within 9 days. None had offered anything resembling a reasonable explanation. One claimed he lacked workers, another said his fleet had broken down, and the third hadn't even bothered to return the call. On the other side of the city, members of the old guard had started dining together again, more frequently, in larger numbers, and always in the same place. Gio spoke the name, then allowed it to lie between them for a long time. Enzo took a sip of coffee and didn't answer. Gio continued in the voice of a man too old to speak indirectly. In the old days, the matter would have been settled in a single night. One conversation in a secluded place, one message delivered to the proper recipient, and by the following morning, the 3 contractors would remember that they still had workers, that their vehicles were operating perfectly well, and that their telephones could still receive calls. He said all Enzo did now was sign papers, call lawyers, and wait. And while he waited, people were slowly gnawing away one piece at a time. By the time he realized what was happening, there would be nothing left to protect. Enzo set down his coffee. He said Gio wanted him to win in a way that would force him to hide his hands whenever he shook another man's. He said Gio had been sitting at that table since Enzo was too short to see over the counter, so he knew perfectly well how many times Enzo's father had won that way, and he also knew what the man had possessed in the end. Enzo said he had no intention of living another 20 years only to sit down one morning and explain to some child where everything in that child's home had come from. Gio fell silent. He looked down at his coffee, then out the window, and finally said only that he hoped Enzo still had enough time to do things his way. Enzo said he hoped so too. The 2 men remained there a while longer, speaking about smaller matters: Gio's grandchildren, the price of flour, and the city's plans to tear up the street and replace the pipes. Then Gio rose, squeezed Enzo's shoulder once, and left. Near noon, when all the morning workers had arrived and the bakery had begun filling with customers, Enzo removed his apron, hung it on the hook behind the counter, and walked out to the car. Nico was already waiting on the street. They drove toward downtown, passing neighborhoods where water had gathered around the storm drains, and arrived at Harborline Tower about 40 minutes before the meeting to renew the internal delivery contract. Enzo didn't go upstairs immediately. He entered the cafe in the lobby, sat at his usual table beside the stone column in the intersection, turned his back toward the entrance, and opened the file to read. His men were scattered across 2 nearby tables, eating lunch and speaking quietly. He didn't look up even once. He read one page after another while the rain continued falling outside, unaware that only 20 minutes later, the entire lobby would fall silent in a way he would remember for the rest of his life. The final delivery of that morning should have been the easiest. 1 box of documents, 1 signature, 1 floor, and afterwards Sadie would have 40 minutes to sit down and finish the remaining slice of bread in her backpack. But when she pushed the delivery cart to the rear entrance of Harborline Tower, a temporary notice had been taped to the freight elevator door. Written by hand, it said the elevator was being repaired, and no one knew when it would be working again. She stood there for a moment, rainwater dripping from the edge of her hood onto the back of her hand, and made the calculation that people like her made many times every day. If she waited, she would be late. If she called upstairs to ask what to do, she would still be late and would become the person causing trouble. If she abandoned the delivery, she would lose the payment and her on-time rating, and that rating determined how many orders she would be allowed to accept the following week. She removed the document box from the cart, held it against her chest, and walked toward the stairs. 30 floors. She stopped counting when she reached the 9th because counting only made the distance feel longer. She climbed in short stretches, stopping at every landing, one hand gripping the railing while the other supported the bottom of the box, and she noticed that her breathing no longer sounded like her own. Somewhere in the 20s, she sat completely down on a step for about a minute, her head lowered, waiting for the world before her eyes to stop tilting. Then she rose and continued. By the time she placed the document box on the reception counter of the client's office, she was 11 minutes late, and the lower right corner of the cardboard had absorbed enough water to leave a dark stain. The receptionist looked at the wet corner, refused to sign for a damaged package, and ordered Sadie to take it back. Sadie took the passenger elevator down to the lobby, and that was when she saw Priscilla Vance, standing in the middle of the granite floor, with her arms folded across her chest, her eyes already fixed on Sadie, before the elevator doors had fully opened. Priscilla didn't tell her to follow her into a room. She didn't lead her somewhere private, or draw her aside behind a column. She remained in the center of the lobby at the busiest point of the lunch hour, where 3 banks of elevators, a cafe, and at least 30 people surrounded them, and she called Sadie's name. Sadie stopped. Priscilla asked whether she knew what day it was. Sadie apologized for being late, and explained that the freight elevator was out of service, so she had been forced to climb the stairs. Priscilla said she hadn't asked for an explanation. She had asked whether Sadie knew what day it was. Sadie said she did. Priscilla said that in that case, Sadie also knew she had been standing there for nearly an hour to ensure that the first delivery made under the renewed contract was conducted properly, and what Sadie had brought upstairs was a wet box. Sadie apologized again. She said she had done everything she could, and that the documents inside hadn't been damaged. Priscilla said doing everything one could was what people said when they had failed to do their jobs. Then she looked down slowly, allowing her gaze to travel from Sadie's face to the rest of her body, and said that if Sadie was in this condition, she should have understood her own limitations, and refrained from accepting so many orders instead of forcing the company to suffer the consequences of matters belonging to her private life. The entire lobby heard those words. Sadie remained still. Then she said, in a voice no louder than usual, that during the past 11 months, she hadn't missed a single shift and had completed her full number of deliveries every day. That was all. 1 sentence, and she said nothing more. The slap cracked through the stone lobby. For the next 3 seconds, the entire building made no sound. Behind the cafe counter, the young woman pouring coffee stopped and set the glass down, though she didn't truly set it down so much as release it, and the sound of glass touching stone rang as clearly as a knock. Near the main entrance, a young security guard straightened, looked toward them for a single beat, then turned his face away and stared into the rain outside. The document box slipped from Sadie's hands, struck the stone floor, and burst open, sending papers sliding outward in a wet white trail. The strap of her backpack slipped from her shoulder. The mouth of the bag fell open, and something rolled out. It made one slow turn across the polished stone, before stopping exactly 1 step from the feet of the man, seated at the table in the inner part of the cafe. It was a firefighter's helmet. Priscilla pointed toward the scattered papers and ordered Sadie to pick them up. And Sadie, 27 years old, 6 months pregnant, with $61 in her account and rent due at the end of the week, placed one hand against the cold stone floor and lowered herself in the middle of the lobby before 30 people. then began gathering the wet pages one at a time, neither quickly nor slowly, as though it were the most ordinary task in the world. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. At the table in the inner part of the cafe, the man who hadn't raised his head once during the past 20 minutes closed the file. The chair slid back with a short scrape across the stone floor, and the man rose. He didn't walk toward Priscilla. He bent down to where the helmet lay a single step from his feet, lifted it with both hands the way someone holds something that doesn't belong to him, and turned it over. Inside the rim, where the lining had worn thin, a line of words had been embossed on a small metal plate. He read it, then he stood perfectly still. Not for long, only for the length of a single breath. But Nico, who sat at the next table and had followed him for many years, knew at once that something had just happened inside that man, something no one else in the lobby could see. Enzo didn't say a word about the inscription. He folded the inner band back into place, walked around the trail of white papers bleeding rainwater across the floor, and stopped about an arm's length from Sadie. He didn't remain standing over her. He crouched down with one knee raised until he was level with her, then held out the helmet. Sadie looked up. One of the wet pages was still in her hand. He gave her the helmet and asked her only one question, his voice as ordinary as if he were asking the time. Did it hurt? Sadie opened her mouth. She meant to say she was fine, because that was what she had told everyone for the past 5 months, and the words came more easily than anything else. But she couldn't say them. She only looked at him, and when her hands closed around the helmet, it trembled between them. Priscilla stepped forward. She didn't know who this man was. All she saw was a customer having lunch who had inserted himself into an internal matter at her company, and she told him, in the same voice she had just used on Sadie, that this was between her and her employee, that he needed to step aside, and that if he wished to discuss it, he could contact her office through the proper channels. Enzo stood. He looked at her for a moment, no longer than necessary, then took his phone from the inside pocket of his coat and dialed a number. The person on the other end answered almost immediately. Enzo said 3 things. First, he told the person that a security incident had just occurred in the main lobby, that there were witnesses, and that all surveillance footage beginning at 12:15 had to be preserved without being overwritten. Second, he said the shipping contract with Beacon Courier had expired the previous month and was currently being renewed 1 week at a time, which meant every security provision remained fully in force. Third, he ordered all building access for that contractor suspended, effective immediately. Then he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Priscilla stared at him. She began to say that he had no authority, but she didn't finish. At the far end of the lobby, someone in a Beacon uniform swiped a card at the freight elevator entrance, and the reader gave a short beep, the sound of a red light instead of a green one. The person swiped again. The same sound answered. A few seconds later, at the rear entrance, another person swiped a card, and the machine gave a second beep. Then a third came from the western security door, farther away, echoing through the stone lobby with a dry, clean finality. Priscilla lifted a hand to the badge hanging from the cord around her neck. She walked to the nearest elevator door and swiped it. The reader beeped. She swiped again, more slowly this time, and the machine gave exactly the same sound. The entire lobby was silent. Dozens of people remained where they stood. No one was pretending to be busy anymore, and every one of them heard the beeps from the card readers sounding one after another, like a count being called aloud. Priscilla turned back. The color had drained from her face. She asked him who he was. Enzo didn't answer. He looked down at Sadie, who was still sitting on the stone floor with the helmet in her lap and wet pages scattered around her. Then he raised his eyes to Priscilla and said, calmly, no louder than an ordinary conversational voice, "You just did that in my house." They took her to St. Vincent Hospital that afternoon, and Sadie sat in the obstetrics clinic with the helmet resting in her lap because she wouldn't put it back in her backpack. Dr. Halloran wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm, inflated it, then sat looking at the monitor. She said nothing. She removed the cuff, told Sadie to sit still for another 2 minutes, then wrapped it around her arm again and took a second reading. And it was that second reading that frightened Sadie. Not the slap, not the entire lobby watching her, but the fact that a doctor who had practiced medicine for so many years believed she needed to check again. Dr. Halloran removed the cuff, set it down, and didn't read the number aloud. She asked Sadie how many hours she spent on her feet each day. Sadie said 11 or 12, depending on the day. She asked how many meals Sadie ate. Sadie was silent. She asked how many times Sadie had postponed her appointments. Sadie said she would make them up. Dr. Halloran sat down in the chair across from her, closer than usual, and spoke in the voice of someone who had no time to soften the truth. She told Sadie that her body wasn't strong enough to carry her through the rest of this pregnancy. She said Sadie's blood pressure was at a level where she didn't want to see it, that she was anemic, and that what she was forcing her body to do every day was something even a healthy person shouldn't be doing. She said Sadie needed to rest. And rest didn't mean cutting back on a few deliveries. It meant stopping. Sadie listened to everything. Then she asked the only question she truly needed answered. How much would today cost? Dr. Halloran told her to ask at the front desk. Sadie went to the front desk. She set the helmet on the counter, opened her wallet, and the woman behind the glass typed her name into the computer, studied the screen for a moment, then said she didn't have a bill. Sadie said there had to be a mistake. The woman entered the information again, more slowly this time, then repeated that the charges had been handled through an account belonging to Harborline Tower, that the account had existed at the hospital for many years, and that Sadie didn't owe anything. Sadie stood motionless at the counter for so long that the person waiting behind her had to clear their throat. She picked up the helmet and walked into the hallway. He was standing there near the glass doors, his hands in his pockets, waiting. And for the first time in 5 months, Sadie Brennan raised her voice. She asked him what he thought he was doing. She said she hadn't asked him for anything. She said she had been taking care of herself long before he knew she existed, that she would pay the bill herself, even if she had to make monthly payments until the following year, and that he had no right to make decisions for her about the things that belonged to her. Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and she hated that more than she hated the slap. She said she wasn't a good deed for someone to finish before the afternoon ended, and then go home feeling righteous enough to sleep well. Several people passing through the hallway turned to look. Enzo didn't argue. He didn't offer a single word of explanation. He waited until she had said everything, then took a business card from his coat pocket and placed it on the plastic chair beside her instead of putting it into her hand. He said that if she wanted to pay for it herself, she would need a job, and the number on that card was his. Then he left. Sadie stared at the business card on the chair for another moment before picking it up. The next morning, she woke at 5:30 as usual, opened the company app, and saw a gray notification stating that her account had been temporarily suspended pending a compliance review. There was no end date. There was no name of anyone responsible. She called customer service. The first person listened to her and transferred the call. The second told her it wasn't their department and transferred her again. The third, whose weary voice carried the weight of someone who had repeated these words far too many times, explained that under the contract Sadie had signed, she wasn't an employee of Beacon Courier. She was an independent service partner. The company hadn't fired her, because the company had never hired her. It had merely suspended her access to the platform, and the company had the right to do so under the terms she herself had clicked to accept. There was no human resources department where she could file a complaint, because she didn't belong to any human resources department. There was nothing to sue over. Sadie thanked the person, sincerely, then ended the call. She went outside and sat on the concrete steps in front of her apartment building. The rain had stopped, but the steps were still wet. She opened a job search app and stared at the search box for a long time. Then she typed a sentence no one should ever have to type. She was looking for work that didn't require much standing. She stared at those words on the screen. She didn't press search. She turned off her phone and sat there with both hands resting on her knees, in the middle of a Wednesday morning, while the entire city was going to work. While Sadie sat on the wet concrete steps, Enzo Castellano was alone in the security room on the first basement level of Harborline Tower, with 4 glowing monitors before him. He had told the security officer on duty to leave. He opened the footage beginning at 12:15 and let it play. He watched it all the way through once. Then he rewound it and watched it a second time. On the third viewing, he was no longer watching Priscilla. He was watching the moment the other woman placed one hand on the stone floor for support, the way she drew her shoulders inward before lowering herself, and the way she picked up the first page, and then the second with a calm that could only have come from being accustomed to such things. He rewound that part. He watched it again. Gio Falcone came in near the end of the afternoon, closed the door behind him, and stood watching the screen for a while before pulling out a chair and sitting down. He said Enzo had been down there for 4 hours. He said there were 3 contractors who had walked away, a name growing more powerful on the other side of the city, and 2 phone calls Enzo hadn't returned. And he truly couldn't understand why a man whom the entire city had to schedule time to see was sitting there replaying a few dozen seconds of footage about a delivery worker, whose name he didn't even know. Enzo paused the video. He remained silent long enough for Gio to understand that the answer coming next wouldn't be the one he had already prepared himself to argue against. Then Enzo asked whether Gio remembered what his mother had done before his father married her. Gio said she had worked the night shift in several office buildings on Westminster Street. Enzo said that was right, then told him there was something she had never told anyone, not even his father, not even Gio. During the winter when she was pregnant with Enzo, when her belly had grown too large to hide any longer, a watch disappeared from the office of the building manager. They summoned her to the lobby. Not into a room, not somewhere private, but into the lobby, just as the day shift was arriving and the night shift was leaving, at the busiest moment of the day. In front of everyone, the manager said she had stolen it, that everyone knew what people like her were like, and that she had to leave the building immediately and never return. She didn't argue. She stood there and listened to every word, then walked out, and she walked all the way home because she didn't have enough money left in her pocket for the bus. A few days later, they found the watch in the desk drawer of the very man who had accused her. No one called her. No one apologized. No one thought it was necessary, because she had already gone, and people who had gone no longer appeared on anyone's list. Enzo said she had never told him that story in more than 30 years. He learned about it only during her final 9 days, when she lay in intensive care after the explosion, when she could no longer keep anything locked inside her, and she told him one night while he sat beside her bed until morning. She told it as though it had happened to someone else. She didn't cry. She only said that after all those years, she still remembered exactly where on the floor she had looked down, and she remembered the pattern of the tile in that spot. She told him that people don't remember the words others say to them. They only remember where they had to lower their eyes while listening. Gio sat in silence for a long time. He had known Rosaria Castellano since she was a young woman selling bread on the corner of Atwell's, and he had never heard a single word about any of it. He asked Enzo what he intended to do. Enzo played the footage again, and stopped it on the exact frame where the woman was bending down. He said he wasn't going to save her, because he had no right to save anyone. He said his mother had lived an entire lifetime carrying that morning with her into those final 9 days, carrying it through her wedding, through his birth, through every dinner they had shared for more than 30 years, while not one person in that lobby had known they had just helped place that burden inside her. He said the woman on the screen was carrying a child, and 20 years from now, that child would grow up in a home where this afternoon would already be living somewhere, even if no one ever told the story. Then he turned off the screen and said he could look away. Anyone could look away. Everyone in that lobby had looked away, and that was precisely why he wouldn't. He came late the following afternoon, alone, with no car waiting outside and no one standing in the hallway. Sadie opened the door with the chain still fastened, peered through the narrow gap, and needed a moment to recognize the man standing there. She didn't invite him inside. He didn't ask to come in. He stood in the apartment hallway amid the damp smell of the old carpet and the sound of a television drifting from the unit next door. And he told her immediately why he had come, because he knew she would close the door if he wasted time circling around it. He said his transportation company needed a route dispatcher at the South Warehouse. The job involved sitting in front of 2 monitors, planning routes for about 30 trucks, handling breakdowns and traffic delays, making calls, and keeping records. The shift was 8 hours, with a lunch break, a chair to sit in, and insurance after the first month. He said the pay wasn't high, and he gave her the exact figure without dressing it up, without adding that it was better than what she had earned before, though they both knew it was. Sadie listened to everything. Then, still speaking through the gap in the door, she asked him what kind of work he did. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't smile, evade the question, or tell her he owned several buildings. He said his name was Enzo Castellano, and if she asked any older person in the North End about that name, they would fall silent for a moment before answering her. He said his father had run things he wasn't going to describe while standing in this hallway, and when his father died, those things had passed into his hands before he was wise enough to understand what he was holding. He said that for the past several years, he had been dismantling it piece by piece, bringing into the light whatever could be brought there, and cutting away whatever couldn't, and the work wasn't finished. He said he wasn't a good man, and he didn't intend to stand there trying to persuade her that he was. He would only tell her that the job was real, the warehouse was real, and her paycheck would come from a company that paid every tax it owed. Sadie stood behind the door with the chain still fastened and listened to every word. She thanked him. Then she said she wouldn't take the job. She said she didn't know what he wanted, and she was too tired to spend what little strength she had left trying to guess at other people's intentions. She said no one gave anyone anything without a reason, and she had been learning that lesson for a long time. He nodded. He didn't say anything more. He told her the number was still there, then turned and walked away. Sadie closed the door, leaned her back against it, and stood motionless in the dark apartment until she heard his footsteps descend the last of the stairs. Half an hour later, she heard paper rustling through the gap beneath the door. She bent down and picked it up. It was a notice from the landlord, printed in advance, with her name written by hand at the top, informing her that the terms of her lease would be adjusted at the beginning of the following month. The new rent was higher by an amount that made her read it twice, to be certain her eyes hadn't deceived her. Beneath it, a line in small print stated that if the tenant didn't agree, she could give 30 days' notice and move out. She carried the paper into the kitchen, placed it on the table, and sat down. She didn't cry. She opened the refrigerator, looked inside, closed it again, then went on sitting there. Outside, the rain began to fall once more. She sat that way until nearly midnight, and throughout all those hours, she did only one thing. She calculated. She calculated the new rent. She calculated the hospital bill she couldn't allow to remain unpaid. She calculated what kind of work a person who couldn't stand for long could do in this city. She calculated how many weeks remained before no one would hire her to do anything at all. The next morning, before the sky had fully brightened, she took the business card from the drawer and called. He answered after the second ring. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how he was. She said she would accept a 2-week trial, and if he decided at the end of those 2 weeks that she couldn't do the work, he should tell her plainly. She would leave and ask no further questions. Then she said the second part, the part she had rehearsed in her mind throughout the night. The medical bill he had paid at St. Vincent Hospital would be deducted from her wages each month until the entire amount had been repaid. She wanted that agreement in writing, and if he didn't accept those terms, she wouldn't take the job. The other end of the line was silent for a while. Then he said, agreed. She asked what time she should arrive. He said 7 o'clock. By the third day, Sadie had grown accustomed to her place. Her desk stood against the glass wall separating the dispatch area from the office beyond, with 2 monitors, a radio, and a chair with a backrest that still felt strange to her every time she sat down. Near 10 o'clock that morning, a broad man with hair streaked with gray was called into the inner office. He was the warehouse manager, Ridge Marlowe, and Sadie had heard several of the loaders mention him twice in 2 days, both times lowering their voices as he passed. The door closed. The glass wall wasn't completely soundproof, and she sat less than 3 steps away. Enzo didn't invite the man to sit. He pushed a sheet of paper across the desk and told him to read it. Ridge read it. Then Enzo said that during the past 3 months, the night shift allowances for more than a dozen loaders had been approved and transferred in full, but by the time the money reached them, it was no longer the full amount. He stated the difference between the 2 figures without placing emphasis on a single word. Ridge began talking about the software system, about errors in the timesheets, about how he would have everything reviewed. Enzo let him finish. Then he pushed a second sheet of paper across the desk and said it was a statement for an account held in the name of Ridge's wife. He gave the dates of the 3 deposits made into that account, and after that, he said nothing. The room remained silent for nearly 10 seconds. Ridge's voice changed. He said he would pay it back. Enzo said yes, he would, within 7 days, and he wouldn't repay the company. He would put the money into the hands of each worker himself, with Enzo present, and he would tell every one of them exactly what he had taken. Then Enzo told him the last part. Once that was done, Ridge would submit his resignation, and he would never work in the transportation industry in this state again. Enzo said he wasn't calling the police, then added that he didn't need to. Ridge Marlowe began to plead. He said he had 3 children, that the youngest had just entered 1st grade, that his wife was receiving medical treatment, that he had worked at the warehouse for 9 years. Enzo looked at him for a long time, then said that the other workers had children too, and asked whether Ridge had thought of them at any point. No one answered that question. The door opened, and Ridge walked out with a face drained of color, crossing the dispatch area without looking at anyone. The entire conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes. Sadie remained seated at her desk for a while. Then she stood, knocked on the glass office door, and entered before Enzo could say anything. She told him she had just watched him erase a man's entire life in 4 minutes. She said the man had begged, and she asked whether Enzo had seen his face. Enzo didn't raise his voice, or act offended. He said yes, he had seen it. Then he said he had also seen the faces of those workers on the morning they opened their pay envelopes and discovered that money was missing, and none of them had begged anyone, because they knew begging wouldn't change anything. He said there were always 2 faces in that room, and the person sitting in his chair had no choice but to choose one. Then he asked her which face she wanted him to choose. Sadie stood there. She had no answer. She apologized for entering without being called, then turned away, returned to her desk, and worked the rest of her shift without saying another word to anyone. Near 6 o'clock that evening, as she gathered her things to leave, she glanced at the route assignment board hanging on the wall beside the exit, the large board listing the clients who needed trucks scheduled for the following week. A new line had been written in marker at the bottom of the list, and the ink wasn't entirely dry. Sadie read it once, then read it again. It bore the name Beacon Courier. She stood staring at those words for a long time, one hand still gripping the strap of her backpack, unable to understand why the man in the glass office had just signed a contract with the very company that had thrown her out into the street. Early Sunday morning, Enzo arrived at Harold Kessler's home in Barrington, and the old man answered the door in his house clothes, assuming Enzo had come about the contract signed the week before. Enzo placed a stack of printed pages on the dining table. During the past week, through the new shipping contract with Beacon Courier, his people had been granted enough access to the company's internal system to review its complaint process, and they had found more than he expected. Before the day in the lobby, several complaints had been submitted from an account under the name Sadie Brennan. One concerned being assigned more deliveries than the permitted limit. Another concerned shift changes made without notice. Another concerned points deducted from her punctuality score for deliveries delayed because the freight elevators were broken. Every complaint had stopped at the same level, marked as resolved, with no response ever sent back. Except for one, Enzo turned to the final page and placed his finger on it. That complaint had been sent to the wrong address because one letter in the internal domain name was incorrect, and it had gone straight into the company founder's inbox. The timestamp showed that Harold Kessler had opened it near midnight. 4 minutes later, he had forwarded it to Priscilla Vance with exactly 2 words. "Please handle." Harold sat down. He put on his glasses, read the page from beginning to end, then read it again, and he didn't deny a single word. He remained silent for a long time, long enough for the ticking of the clock on the wall to grow unmistakably clear. Then he removed his glasses and said he had started the company with a rented truck, had driven the first delivery himself, and had once slept in the cab at a parking lot outside Cranston because he couldn't afford a room. He said he still remembered that feeling as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Then he asked, not Enzo but the empty space before him, when he had become the kind of man who could read a plea for help near midnight, press the forward button, and go to sleep. Enzo didn't answer. He left the papers on the table and walked away. Over the next 3 days, as word spread that Harold Kessler had ordered an independent review, other people began to speak. None of them had arranged it with the others. One worked at the sorting warehouse, another was a dispatcher, and several were delivery workers on the northern route. Each person told a different story, but every story ended at the same name. On Sunday afternoon, Enzo returned to the North End. The bakery was closed, but the room upstairs was still lit, and inside stood a long wooden table that had been there since before he was born. 7 men sat around it. Aldo Bertoni occupied the seat at the end near the window, and he didn't wait for anyone to finish pouring the coffee. He said plainly that he was calling for a vote. He said that over the past several months they had lost 3 contractors and 2 port contracts, while the man seated at the head of the table was busy hiring lawyers, opening hospital accounts, and signing contracts with a courier company under investigation. He said that if Enzo's father were still alive, none of this would have been allowed to happen. Then he delivered the line he had been saving. Enzo was trading away everyone at that table for a delivery worker. Enzo didn't argue. He rose and began walking slowly around the table, stopping behind each man. He called the first man by name and reminded him that his daughter was in her final year at school in Kingston, then reminded him where her tuition money came from. Not in the voice of someone collecting a debt, but in the voice of someone reading from a list. He called the second man by name and spoke of his younger brother, of the summer when they had placed him in a treatment center in New Hampshire, instead of abandoning him on the street. He called the third man by name and said only that it had been 3 years since he had needed to look over his shoulder every time he stepped outside his home. Enzo continued that way until he had walked the entire length of the table. When he reached the final man, he stopped and said that the people sitting there wanted to return to the days when every family dinner had an empty chair, and he didn't. He said anyone who wanted to return to those days was free to stand and follow Aldo. The door wasn't locked. The room fell silent. No one stood. Aldo Bertoni remained in his chair with both hands resting on the table, and he looked around once before he understood what had just happened. Enzo returned to his seat. He told Aldo that he still had a place at that table, because that table had never cast anyone out. Then he told him the rest. Beginning the next morning, everyone working for Aldo would receive their wages from Enzo's account, and Enzo had already paid them 6 months in advance. The independent review began the following week. and with it came a collective complaint filed with the State Labor Relations Board under 10 names, with Sadie Brennan's listed first because she was the one captured on video. She hadn't organized anything. She had simply signed where the lawyer pointed, and she believed that was the end of what she had to do. But on the day of her routine appointment at the obstetrics clinic on Blackstone Street, just after she had stepped out of the examination room and sat down to wait for her name to be called, a man rose from the row of chairs opposite her and came to sit beside her. He appeared to be in his 50s, was neatly dressed, spoke softly, and addressed her by her full name. He said he was an attorney representing a party concerned with the welfare of her family, and he told her immediately that he hadn't come to threaten her, hadn't come to ask her to do anything illegal, and would leave at once if she wanted him to. Sadie didn't tell him to leave. He placed a thick paper envelope on her lap. It was already open. Inside was a beautifully printed settlement agreement, with a blank space for her signature. He went over the terms in the voice of someone reading from a menu. $240,000, paid in a single payment. Every expense related to childbirth and care after the birth. A health care plan for the baby lasting until the child entered kindergarten. And a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, transferred into her name, not rented. In exchange, she would withdraw her name from the collective complaint and sign a confidentiality agreement. Still speaking gently, he went on to say that the other 9 people would continue with their case. No one else would be affected, and she wouldn't be betraying anyone. He said cases like this often lasted more than a year, sometimes 2, and during all that time, she would still have to pay rent every month. He said he had read her file and knew she would soon have to move. Then he delivered the final line. She was 7 months pregnant, and the most responsible thing a mother could do was make certain her child had a roof overhead. And the most terrible thing about the entire conversation, the thing that left Sadie sitting motionless long after he had gone, was that everything he said was true. She took the envelope home. She placed it on the kitchen table beside the notice of the rent increase that she still hadn't put away. That evening, she read the agreement once. Then she read it a second time, more slowly. By the third night, she had nearly memorized it, even the small print at the bottom of the pages, and she caught herself repeating the words silently while washing the dishes. She worked out the figures on the back of a bill. With that money, she could repay the hospital expenses the very next day. She could stop working until the baby was born, exactly as Dr. Halloran had told her to do. She could sleep. She hadn't slept through an entire night since spring. She could bring her baby home to a room with a window facing something other than the wall of the building next door. On the 4th night, she took out a pen. She turned to the final page, placed the tip against the signature line, and wrote her first name, Sadie. Then she wrote the first letter of her last name, B. And her hand stopped. She sat that way with the pen still touching the paper, while the ink began spreading into a small dark spot. She thought about years from now, when the child was old enough to ask the questions children always asked, and would want to know why their home belonged to them, instead of being rented, and she wondered how she would answer. She thought about having to lie or tell the truth, and she didn't know which would be worse. She thought of the granite lobby, and of where she might be now, if even one of the 30 people who had stood there that day had accepted an envelope and gone home. She lifted the pen. She didn't finish signing, but she didn't tear up the agreement either. She didn't call the attorney or take it to anyone. She sat a while longer with her unfinished name before folding the agreement along its original creases, slipping it back into the envelope, and placing it in the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet beneath a stack of bills. The contract Sadie couldn't understand began answering for itself one evening that week. When Enzo signed with Beacon Courier, he hadn't merely purchased the right to schedule trucks. He had purchased the right to look inside. His people spent several days tracing the company's chain of ownership, and that chain was longer than it had any reason to be. Beacon belonged to a parent company registered in Delaware. That parent company had 3 shareholders, 2 of them harmless names. The third was an investment fund with a name that sounded like a resort, and that fund had only one investor, Bertone Holdings. Enzo sat before the file in the office behind the bakery, the desk lamp burning while the street outside had fallen quiet, and turned the pages one by one until the entire story arranged itself in a neat line before him. Aldo had bought into Beacon the previous fall. Ever since then, every meeting of its board had revolved around one thing: profit margins. Some minutes explicitly demanded that labor costs be cut to a level any reader would know was impossible to reach, while keeping the existing workforce. And the person forced to carry that figure down through the company, the person who had to stand before the meeting room on the 14th floor and present the plan to move the entire delivery staff onto independent service contracts, the person who had to go down to the Harbor Line lobby on Tuesday at noon and make sure the first delivery looked flawless, was Priscilla Vance. The reason Aldo needed Beacon, the only reason, appeared on the final page. Beacon held the internal transportation contract for Harborline Tower. If that contract was renewed, Bertone vehicles would enter and leave Enzo's building every day. Bertone's people would move through the basement levels. They would have keys, door codes, and schedules. Aldo didn't need to strike him. He only needed to place one foot inside. Enzo remained still for a long time after he finished reading. He thought about that afternoon, about how he had believed he happened to be there, happened to be sitting with his back to the entrance, happened to hear a sound in the middle of the lunch hour. Nothing had happened by chance. That woman had been standing in the lobby of his building at that precise moment because someone wanted a place inside his house, and the hand that had risen against her had begun moving months earlier, in a meeting room she would never be permitted to enter, among people who would never know her name. Gio arrived near midnight, sat down in the chair opposite him, and read the entire file without speaking. When he reached the final page, he put it down and cursed softly. Enzo didn't look at him. He stared out the window and asked whether Gio remembered Doyle Transit. Gio looked up. He remembered. Enzo continued in an even voice. 4 years earlier, he had needed berth number 9, and Warren Doyle had refused to sell. Enzo hadn't sent anyone to see him. He hadn't called to threaten him. He had simply purchased the company's bank debt, then tightened his grip on one obligation after another, all within the law, every deadline observed, with an attorney beside him at every step. 41 days. By the final day, Doyle Transit had nothing left, and Warren Doyle was 64 years old, and he lost his home at the same time he lost his company, because he had mortgaged it long before. Enzo said that several months later, Doyle had been found alone in a rented room on Chalkstone Street. Enzo said he hadn't been there. He hadn't known the man. He hadn't met him once during those 41 days. He had only signed papers. Then he said what he had never told anyone. It had taken him a very long time to understand that signing papers could kill people too, only more slowly, and the person signing never had to see it happen. He said that was the real reason he had begun dismantling everything, not because he had suddenly become a decent man. He had done it because one morning he looked into a mirror and realized he had become the very thing that had driven his mother out of a building. Gio sat in silence. Then he asked what Enzo intended to do if someone uncovered the Doyle story, if someone on the other side found it and dragged it into the open before a crowd. Enzo said he would tell the truth. Gio looked at him for a long time and said that was the fastest way to lose everything he was trying to preserve. Sadie didn't wait until the 30 days were over. She called her landlord during the 3rd week and told him she was leaving, and he answered in the voice of someone who had known what she would say from the moment he sent the notice. She found a temporary place to stay on the Pawtucket side of town, with a woman who had once worked the same route as she had. A room at the back of the house with its own entrance, costing 1/3 of what she had paid before. On her final night on Bramble Street, the apartment was nearly empty. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. Everything had been packed, and only a mattress spread across the floor and a single lamp plugged into an outlet near the baseboard remained. She was wrapping the last few things from the cabinet beneath the sink when her hand touched a thick plastic bag, the kind with a zipper seal and a label along the edge, the kind hospitals return to a patient's family. She had received it in March and pushed it into that cabinet the same afternoon. For 5 months, she had walked past that cabinet every day, and she had never opened it once. She sat down on the floor with the bag in her lap and remained that way for a long time. Then she pulled open the seal. There wasn't much inside. A leather wallet bent out of shape, a ring of keys, a thin silver chain, and a phone, its glass cracked at one corner, the lower part of its case scorched into a dark stain. She picked it up and pressed the power button. Nothing happened. She searched through the boxes for a charging cable, plugged it in, and sat staring at the black screen in the darkness of the empty apartment. Nearly 10 minutes later, a small spark of light appeared in one corner of the screen. Then the phone started. She entered 4 numbers, her birthday, and it unlocked on the first try. The background was still the photograph of the two of them at Narragansett Beach the previous summer, the wind blowing her hair across half his face. She opened the photo folder. Then she saw another folder labeled Videos, and inside it were many files. She counted them briefly, then stopped. There were several dozen clips, each less than a minute long, the earliest dating back to February of that year. She opened the first one. Owen's face appeared on the screen inside the cab of the fire truck, beneath a yellow overhead light, with the crackle of the radio behind him. He looked into the camera, lowered his voice as if he were afraid someone beside him might hear, and said hello to the baby. He said Dad didn't know who you were yet, that your mother had told him the news only yesterday, and that he was sitting in the truck with no idea what to do with it except tell you one thing. The video lasted a little more than 40 seconds. He didn't say anything grand. He only said that Dad was happy. Sadie opened the second clip, then the third. And there, in the apartment, emptied of everything else, she sat and watched one after another. In one, he had filmed before dawn and said the shift had been quiet, so he would probably be home early. In another, he laughed and said your mother had cooked something today that couldn't be eaten, but Dad had eaten every bite anyway. In another, he talked about needing to repair the second stair because it creaked, and told the baby to remember to remind him. In one clip, he sat silently for several seconds before saying only that Dad was a little tired, then turned off the camera. There was one filmed in the middle of winter. He wore a knit cap, his nose was red from the cold, and he said Dad had thought of a name, but he hadn't told your mother yet because he was saving it. He never said the name aloud. Sadie reached the final clip when the sky was nearly bright. It had been recorded before dawn on the last day of his life. He looked more tired than in any of the others, his face unshaven, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep, and he had to adjust the phone twice before the image was straight. He said Dad had just finished his shift, but an alarm had come in, so he was going back, probably only for a little while. Then he fell silent for a moment. Then he smiled, the way he always smiled when he was about to say something that embarrassed him a little, and said that Dad didn't know whether you were a boy or a girl, that he kept guessing, and still couldn't decide. But there was one thing Dad knew for certain. Your mother is the strongest person Dad has ever known. If Dad comes home late, watch your mother and learn from her. The video ended. Sadie sat on the floor among the cardboard boxes, still holding the phone, while the light beyond the window turned the gray of early morning. She didn't cry aloud. She simply remained there for a long time, then set the phone down, stood, and went to wash her face. At 7 o'clock that morning, she called the attorney representing the group of 10. She didn't exchange any pleasantries. She said that when the board opened the hearing, she would testify, and she would stand there and tell the entire story from beginning to end. While preparing for the hearing, the attorney asked whether she remembered anyone who had witnessed the times she had been overwhelmed with too many deliveries, and Sadie spent that entire evening thinking. The name that came to her wasn't the name of a coworker. It was Walt Prosser. During her 11 months making deliveries at Harborline, he had been the only person in that building who called her by name. He held the freight door open for her when both her hands were full, showed her a shortcut through the mechanical area so she wouldn't have to circle outside through the rain, and almost every time he saw her, he asked whether she had eaten lunch. Then there came a time when she stopped seeing him. She remembered asking a security guard, and the guard had said only that the entire maintenance crew had been replaced. It had happened about 3 weeks before the day she was stopped in the middle of the lobby. It took her 2 days to find him. One person sent her to another, and that person sent her to someone else, until at last she found him in a multi-level parking garage near the docks, wearing a reflective vest and working the night shift inside a glass booth. He recognized her immediately, and the first thing he asked was the same question he had always asked. Sadie sat down on the plastic chair inside the booth, and Walt told her what had happened. He said he had worked at Harborline for nearly 20 years, since before the building had installed its glass elevators. He said he wasn't surprised to be replaced by an outside contractor, because that was what people did to workers approaching retirement age. But there was one thing he had found strange, and he had told his wife about it that very night. On the first day of the takeover, someone from the new contractor had asked him for the access code to the server room on the second basement level. They hadn't requested it through the proper handover process or through building management. They had asked him directly, right there, on their first morning. Walt said that in nearly 20 years, no one had ever asked him that question. Sadie called Enzo from the booth. Near 1 o'clock the following morning, the security officer on duty reported that the surveillance archive system was running a data cleanup process that had been scheduled remotely, and it would erase all recordings from the past 60 days. The lobby footage fell directly within that deletion window. Enzo and Nico went down to the second basement level near 2 o'clock. The server room door wouldn't open. The code had been changed, and the change had been made from a computer outside the building. Enzo stood before that door for nearly half a minute. Then Sadie, sitting in the car in the parking garage above because she had followed them there, and he wouldn't let her go downstairs, remembered the card in her wallet. It was the maintenance contractor card Walt had slipped to her several months earlier so she wouldn't have to wait outside the freight entrance on days when no one was on duty, something he hadn't been allowed to give her, and she hadn't been allowed to keep. And for that very reason, no personnel system knew it existed and no one had been able to deactivate it. Nico ran upstairs to get it. Sadie remained in the car, turned on the speaker, and held the phone in her lap. She heard the card swipe. She heard the door open. She heard the server fans humming inside the enclosed room. Then she heard Enzo say, in the ordinary voice of someone reading from a list, that the process was running and there was a countdown clock on the screen, and he needed her to read it for him because both his hands were about to be occupied. Nico turned on his own phone's speaker and placed the phone beside the monitor. Sadie watched the screen of her phone, where Nico was showing her the image, and began to read. 11 minutes. She counted down each minute, then every half minute, and finally every 10 seconds. She heard glass break when Enzo smashed the tool case mounted on the wall. She heard metal scraping against metal. She heard Nico say something urgently, and Enzo told him to step back. She heard the rhythm of Enzo's breathing change. She sat inside the car with both hands wrapped around the phone, her eyes fixed on the falling numbers, unable to see anything else. Those were the longest 11 minutes she had ever endured. With a little more than 20 seconds remaining, she heard a click, then the sound of the fans slowing, then silence. Then Enzo's voice came through, low and breathless, saying it was done. When they reached the parking garage, the sky was still dark and the rain had stopped. Nico carried the hard drive, while Enzo walked behind him, his right hand gripping his left wrist, and even beneath the garage's pale yellow lights, Sadie could see that something was wrong with his hand. He said it was nothing. She didn't argue with him. She opened the car door, told him to sit down, then tore her own shirt sleeve lengthwise until she had a strip of cloth long enough to use. She took his hand and wrapped it. He remained silent and let her. It was the first time they had ever touched. 3 days later, he sent her a single message asking whether she could come by the bakery that evening, adding that there was something he had to tell her before the hearing. She arrived near 8 o'clock, when the metal shutter had been lowered halfway and only the light behind the counter remained on. He opened the door for her, his left hand still wrapped in bandages. He didn't invite her to sit down right away. He led her into the back room, to the wall on the right, where a staircase had been sealed with boards nailed diagonally across it, and a notice whose 4 corners had yellowed with age. He stood before it and said there was a 2-room apartment upstairs. His mother had lived there for 30 years. He said he had bought her a house in East Greenwich, with a yard and someone who came to clean every week, but she had stayed there exactly 4 days before telling him to take her home. She had said she couldn't sleep anywhere that didn't smell of flour in the morning. He said they had argued about it many times over many years, and he had never won once. Then he said the gas explosion in March had happened up there, on the 2nd floor, not down here. Sadie stood motionless. He went on to say that a volunteer firefighter had gone inside and pulled his mother out, and she had lived for another 9 days in the intensive care unit at St. Vincent Hospital. He turned to look at Sadie and said she had already heard the story of his mother, but there was one part he had never told anyone. On the 8th night, when his mother was very weak and her voice had nearly disappeared, she told him to bend closer. She asked whether the young man was all right. Enzo had lied to her. He had said the young man was fine. His mother looked at him, and she knew. Then she told him that the firefighter had carried her outside, laid her down on the sidewalk, and she had taken hold of his hand and said there was one more person trapped in the kitchen. Enzo stopped. Then he said there had been no one in the kitchen. There had been no one in that apartment except his mother. She had said it because she hadn't wanted to be taken outside, because she was over 80, because she had lived there for 30 years and hadn't wanted to stand in the street watching it burn. When the firefighter heard her, he turned and went back inside, and he never came out again. Enzo said the last thing his mother had ever spoken to him wasn't a farewell or a final expression of love. It was an order. She told him to find the firefighter's family. She told him he had to repay the debt for her. Sadie sat down in the nearest chair. She didn't sit because she wanted to. She sat because her legs could no longer hold her. And there, in that empty bakery, for the first time since March, for the first time in this entire story, Sadie Brennan wept. She wept without making a sound, both hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling. And he didn't go near her. He remained where he was and let her cry until there were no tears left. A long time later, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up. She asked whether he had been searching for her for 5 months. He said yes. She asked whether he had known the name before the day in the lobby. He said no. He said he had only known the unit, and Engine 4 had many people, and the memorial fund he had established through a third party had been refused by one family, but no one would tell him which family it was. Sadie sat silently for a while. Then she asked the question she had been holding in her mind since the moment he used the word order. She asked what that made her in his story. Was she the debt his mother had left behind? The way he redeemed what he had done to Mr. Doyle? Or merely the cleanest piece he possessed in his game against Bertone? Enzo didn't answer at once. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and said he wouldn't lie to her, even if the truth was worse. During the first 3 weeks, she had been all 3 of those things. He had begun because of the debt, and continued because of the game. And at that time, she had been nothing more than a name in a file. Then he said there had been a night when he sat replaying the lobby footage for the 11th time. He had possessed all the evidence he needed by the second viewing. He hadn't played it an 11th time because he was searching for anything. He had played it again because he wanted to know what she had been thinking during the 3 seconds before she lowered herself to her knees. He said he sat there until morning and still didn't know. But from that night onward, she was no longer a name in a file. Sadie stood. She picked up her bag, walked toward the door, and stopped there with one hand resting on the metal shutter that was still raised halfway. She didn't turn to look at him. She said that during those 3 seconds, she had thought only one thing. Thank God the baby isn't old enough to remember. Then she bent beneath the shutter, stepped outside, and walked into the rain. The hearing opened on a morning near the end of the month, in a meeting room on the 3rd floor of the State Administration Building on Westminster Street. There was no raised bench and no gavel. Only 3 board members seated behind a long table, a projector, and several rows of folding chairs. Sadie arrived early and sat in the front row with both hands resting on the cloth bag in her lap. The first thing presented was the video recording. Some of the lights were turned off, and the granite lobby appeared on the white screen. Without sound, only images. The footage ran for less than 2 minutes. When it ended, no one in the room spoke for longer than was customary. Then the attorney representing Beacon Courier rose. He was younger than Sadie had expected, neatly dressed, with a clear voice, and he said nothing about the footage they had just watched. He asked about her work application. He asked whether she had disclosed her medical condition to the company. Sadie said she hadn't. He asked whether she knew that under the company's internal rules, delivery workers were required to report any condition affecting their ability to perform the job. Sadie said she did. He asked why she hadn't reported it. She was silent for several seconds. Then she said that during the previous year and a half, 4 women on her team had informed the company that they were pregnant. She gave the names of all 4 women. She said that within 2 weeks, every one of them had been reduced to 3 shifts a week. None had received any written explanation, and by the end of the year, all 4 had left. She said she had watched it happen 4 times, and she had needed that job more than all 4 of those women combined. She said she wasn't making excuses. She was only answering his question. The attorney sat down. The second person called was Walt Prosser. He wore a shirt buttoned all the way to the collar, the kind of shirt he probably didn't wear often, and he sat with his back straight throughout the hearing. He said he had worked in maintenance at Harborline for nearly 20 years, named the 3 generations of management he had served under, and said he had never received a single letter of reprimand. He said he had been replaced by an outside contractor. Then he described the first morning, when someone from the new contractor had asked him directly for the access code to the server room on the 2nd basement level, without going through management and without any paperwork. One of the board members interrupted to make certain that the request had been made on the very first day. Walt said yes, on the first morning, before they had even taken possession of the supply room. He said that in nearly 20 years, no one had ever asked him that question once. After that came the presentation on internal procedures, and Beacon's attorney rose and spoke at length about how the company had cooperated fully with the independent review, suspended the individual involved, and committed itself to revising its complaint process. Then he made a statement he had probably delivered hundreds of times during his career without ever encountering a problem. He said the company had never, under any circumstances, approached any complainant in this case privately. Sadie opened the cloth bag in her lap. She took out a thick paper envelope, worn along its folds, and stood to ask permission to submit a document. She placed it on the board's table. Inside was the complete settlement agreement, every page intact, with a blank signature line on the final page, where her first name had been written, followed by a single letter standing alone. She said the man who had brought it to her had found her at the obstetrics clinic on Blackstone Street, and she gave the date. She said he had identified himself as an attorney representing a party concerned with the welfare of her family. She said she had kept the document in a kitchen drawer for several weeks, and she had nearly signed it. The meeting room fell silent. Beacon's attorney stared at the paper on the board's table and didn't rise. The final person called that morning was a young woman of 21, who worked at the coffee counter in the Harborline lobby. Tessa Vance sat down and stated her name. When asked how she was related to the person suspended in the case, she said the woman was her mother. Tessa said that when she was 15, her mother had taught her something, a lesson she had repeated many times over the years. There were only 2 kinds of people in the world: those who sat at the table and those who stood waiting at the door, and Tessa had to choose carefully. Tessa said she had made her choice. She said she served coffee in the lobby. She stood waiting at the door, and her mother knew it. Then she said that on that afternoon, she had been standing behind the counter, and she had watched her mother strike someone who was waiting at the door, someone just like her. That afternoon, when the hearing resumed, Beacon's attorney rose and stated his full name for the record for the first time. Curtis Doyle. He was 33 years old, had accepted the case 7 weeks earlier for a fee several times higher than what he usually earned, and had taken it because every month he had to make a payment to the nursing home in Warwick where his mother lived, a woman who hadn't remembered her son's name since the previous spring. He didn't know who Enzo Castellano was. He knew only that his father had once owned a small transportation company, that the company had collapsed in less than 2 months because someone had purchased its debt, and that the name on the documents had belonged to a shell company in Delaware that Curtis had spent 4 years trying and failing to trace. That afternoon, he requested that the head of Harborline Tower be called as an interested party, and when Enzo sat down in the chair before the board, Curtis Doyle did exactly what any attorney in his position would have done. He didn't attack the incident. He attacked the man. He asked Enzo about his family's business activities. He asked about the harbor project. Then he asked the question he had prepared as his conclusion, his voice measured and without hostility. Had Mr. Castellano ever caused a family to lose everything they had? It was an open question with nothing behind it. There was no file on the table. No one in that room could have proven otherwise if Enzo said no. His private attorney sat in the front row, shook his head slightly, and lifted 2 fingers to the edge of the table, signaling that he shouldn't answer. In the row behind him, Sadie sat motionless with her hands in her lap. Enzo looked at Curtis Doyle for a moment. Then he said yes. He said that 4 years earlier, during the fall, he had purchased the bank debt of a transportation company and driven it into collapse over 41 days. He said the company's name was Doyle Transit. He said its owner was Warren Doyle, and he gave the date of the man's death. Then he delivered the final part while looking directly at the man standing before him. You couldn't find my name in any of the records because I paid to make certain it wasn't there. The entire room went still. The file in Curtis Doyle's hand slipped downward, several pages falling to the floor, and he didn't bend to pick them up. One of the board members asked whether he wished to continue. Curtis requested a recess. 20 minutes later, when the hearing resumed, Curtis Doyle didn't return to his place. He walked directly to the board's table and placed a handwritten document before them. It was a request to withdraw as counsel because of a newly discovered conflict of interest, stating that he had just learned his client hadn't fully disclosed the company's ownership structure when signing the representation agreement. He didn't say another word against Beacon. He didn't look toward Enzo. He simply submitted the document, asked permission to leave the room, and walked out. But the paper remained on the table, and the board couldn't ignore a statement like that. That same afternoon, they ordered the production of every shareholder record belonging to the parent company. Near the end of the session, Priscilla Vance asked to speak. She rose with a stack of papers in her hands, the statement her attorney had prepared for her, and placed it on the table without opening it. She said that when she was 22, she had worked as a telephone operator for an insurance company in Cranston. When she reached the 5th month of her pregnancy, they dismissed her, and the reason written on the notice was department restructuring. She said she had slept in her car for 3 weeks in the parking lot behind a supermarket, and she still remembered the yellow light at the corner of that lot burning through the night. She said she had sworn that she would never stand on the other side of the table again. Then, without changing her voice, she said she had kept that promise by becoming the very thing that had crushed her. She said she had listened to herself tell a team leader that the company paid for results, not reasons. And 21 years earlier, someone had said almost the same words to her. She didn't ask for mercy. She didn't ask for leniency. She asked only to say one thing to the woman sitting in the front row. She turned toward Sadie and said that when she raised her hand, she hadn't seen Sadie. She had seen herself at 22, sitting in that parking lot, and she had hated that image so much that she struck it. Sadie remained silent for a long time. She didn't say that she forgave her. She only said, "You knew what that felt like, and that is precisely why you had no right not to know." Sadie sat down after saying those words, and as she reached for the glass of water on the table, the room tilted. She didn't hear anyone call her name. The person beside her caught her before she fell completely from the chair. And in the next few seconds, everyone in the meeting room rose at once. Enzo was the one who carried her into the hallway. Nico had run down to get the car the moment he heard the chair fall, and it was waiting at the steps of the administration building when they reached the entrance. Enzo laid her across the back seat with her head resting in his lap, and Nico drove. St. Vincent Hospital was 14 blocks away. Nico didn't lean on the horn. He simply drove, watching each intersection carefully, and no one in the car spoke during the first part of the journey. About halfway there, Sadie opened her eyes. She didn't ask where she was. She looked up at the roof of the car, then reached out until she found his hand, his left hand still bearing the marks of the old bandage, and gripped it more tightly than she intended. In a small, broken voice, she said, "Don't let me wake up alone," she said. "I've woken up alone enough times." He told her he would be there. She said nothing more until the car stopped. At the emergency department, they took her away immediately, and Dr. Halloran arrived in less than 10 minutes because she was on duty upstairs. She said Sadie's blood pressure couldn't wait any longer, and they were going to operate. The double doors closed, leaving Enzo alone in the hallway. He stood there for a long time. He didn't call anyone. He had no one to call. The man who had once made more than 30 access cards stop working in 40 seconds. The man who had destroyed a company in 41 days without leaving his desk stood before a door and couldn't do anything at all. He sat down on the plastic chair attached to the wall, rested his hands on his knees, and waited as everyone else had once waited before that door. The baby was born earlier than expected near 8 o'clock that evening, a tiny girl, and they took her to the neonatal intensive care unit for observation. Dr. Halloran came out and told him that both mother and child were stable, that Sadie would sleep until morning, and that the baby needed time in the incubator to gain weight and learn to breathe steadily, but every indicator was moving in the right direction. She said what they hoped to see was the child growing stronger each day, and that was exactly what was happening. He thanked her. Then he stayed. The intensive care unit had strict rules about who was allowed inside, and he didn't belong to any of the permitted groups. He didn't use his name, call anyone on the hospital board, or mention the account that had existed there for years. He simply came every evening, sat in the row of chairs in the hallway across from the glass doors, and left when dawn was near. 9 nights. The head nurse on the night shift was a woman of about 60 who had worked in that unit long enough that nothing surprised her anymore, and for the first 8 nights, she passed him without saying anything. On the 9th night, she stopped before him, studied him for a moment, then told him to wash his hands and put on a gown. He followed her inside. The baby lay in a warm incubator beneath a clear cover, far smaller than he had imagined, both hands curled near her face. He stood beside her and didn't lift her. He didn't ask permission to hold her. He merely extended his left hand, still bandaged across the back, rested it on the edge of the incubator, then sat down in the chair beside it, and remained completely still. The baby slept. He didn't say anything to her. He sat the way people sit beside the bed of someone they know they have reached too late. The following morning, Sadie was allowed to visit her daughter for the first time in a wheelchair. They brought her to the glass doors, and through the narrow opening, she saw him still sitting inside, his head bowed, one hand resting on the edge of the incubator. She asked the person pushing her chair to stop for a moment. She didn't call to him. She sat in the hallway and watched him for a long time. That afternoon, when they brought her the birth certificate to complete, she wrote the baby's name as Juniper, the name she had chosen in the spring and had never told anyone. Then, at the space for the middle name, she paused for a single moment before writing the name of the father her daughter would never meet. 1 year later, on a small street a few blocks from the harbor, a wooden sign hung above the entrance of an old storefront, Brennan Labor Support Center. Sadie rented the place for a token amount, a sum she thought was far too low, though she didn't ask any further questions, and it was a very long time before she accidentally learned what the true market rent for that property had been. She worked there with 2 volunteers, a retired attorney and a college senior, and they accepted cases free of charge from anyone who walked through the door. The board's ruling had been issued in the spring. Everyone who had ever ridden a bicycle through the rain for Beacon Courier was reclassified as an official employee, and on the first payroll after that appeared a line that had never before existed in the company's system: maternity benefits. As for Enzo, after the records of Bertone Holdings were opened and led to an investigation far broader than anything he had anticipated, he lost most of his fortune, 2 harbor contracts, and all the influence his family name had once carried in the city. He worked with prosecutors for nearly a year. He didn't go to prison. That afternoon, the center's door opened, and Priscilla Vance walked in. She hadn't come to apologize. She was working at a warehouse outside Woonsocket, and her new employer hadn't paid her night shift wages in 3 weeks. This was the only place in the state that accepted cases without charging a fee. She knew very well who ran it. She came anyway. Sadie stood, took out a form, sat down across from her, and handled the case according to procedure. asking every necessary question and completing every required field, without adding one word or omitting one. When they finished, Priscilla sat silently for a while, then asked why. Sadie said that if she refused to help her, this table would only become another table. Priscilla nodded. She rose, took the receipt, and before leaving, turned back to ask the baby's name. Sadie told her. Priscilla nodded again and said 2 words. Beautiful name. Then she walked out. On Tuesday morning that week, in the North End, Enzo still bent down, fitted the key into the lock at the bottom of the metal shutter, and raised it with his own hands, as he always had. The boards had been removed from the staircase in the back room during the summer. The second floor was now a small dining room with 4 tables, and on the wall opposite the window hung a bronze plaque engraved with the name of a volunteer firefighter. Near 7 o'clock, Sadie pushed the stroller inside, folded her umbrella, and left it standing in the corner. June was almost 1 year old, with wisps of hair, and she grinned as she slapped both hands against the glass pastry case when she saw the cakes arranged in rows inside. Enzo wiped his hands on his apron and lifted her into his arms. He carried her up several steps, stopped before the wall, and pointed to the bronze plaque. Then he read aloud the name engraved upon it. June reached out, touched the cold metal, and laughed. He did this every morning, and he would continue until she was old enough to understand who the man bearing that name had been and what he had done. Downstairs, Sadie stood behind the counter pouring coffee for a regular customer who had been coming there since before she ever knew that street existed. No one rescued anyone. No one raised their voice. 1 year earlier, she had knelt in the middle of a granite lobby and believed that humiliation was the price she had to pay for having a job. Now she understood something she hoped all of us would learn sooner than she had. People may buy your time, they may buy your labor, but no one in this world can buy the right to humiliate you. And what changed everything in that story wasn't one man's power or money. It was that among 30 people who stood watching, one person chose to stop, step forward, and ask whether she was hurt. Kindness doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it is only the right question, asked at the right moment, of someone whose head is bowed. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that each day we may continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? And if you had been standing in that lobby, what would you have done? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. To everyone watching this video, we wish you abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.